Hello, and welcome to my library. It's filled with curious, dark, and mysterious tales. Dancing, it's fun, it brings people together, allows you to express yourself. But what if you just suddenly couldn't stop? You dance and you dance until it's no longer any fun. You start to panic. What on earth is happening to you? You dance until your feet start bleeding. You're in pain, but you just can't stop. You're sweating, you're tired, your body aches, but you still can't stop. Suddenly, everything goes black. You've collapsed from exhaustion. You awake, only to start the same cycle again. Nightmare fuel, if you ask me. Well, this is what happened to one lady in the 1500s. But what's even more curious is that this strange dancing affliction started to spread. Our story takes us to Strasbourg in the year 1518. It's a city along the River Rhine, and at the time it was part of the Holy Roman Empire, not to be confused with the Roman Empire. The air is perfumed with the lovely smell of excrement, animal and also human. You hear a symphony of flies buzzing around the piles of filth and animals squealing as they're being slaughtered. It's not a good time, the 1500s in Strasbourg. Life was filled with tragedy and hardships. Countless poor harvests led to famine, grain prices were sky high, and the church demanded a sickening amount of money for taxes and tithes. Actually, you know what? It actually kind of sounds a bit like work now. But then, there were also all these plagues and maladies to contend with. There was syphilis, smallpox, the sweating sickness, which was another medical mystery, bubonic plague, the list goes on. There were just so many ways to die a very terrible death. The year before this whole dancing thing happened was so bad that a chronicler at the time summed it up simply as a bad year, so you know it must have been bad. The times were so awful that it inspired works like this. Things were even worse if you happened to be a woman. You were powerless, deemed inferior to men, domestic violence was rife, and you had to keep the household running whilst your husband was out getting drunk and cheating on you. Life was also steeped in superstition, religion and ritual. If something bad was happening, it was likely that God was punishing you, and it would seem that God was very, very angry with the people of Strasbourg. There were also ghosts, demons and vengeful saints to deal with. It just sounds absolutely mentally and physically exhausting. These poor people were broken and devoid of all hope, and you know what? Who can blame them? It was an unusually hot summer in July 1518 when Frau Trophea stepped out of her half-timbered house into the street and started a little bit of toe-tapping, a little bit of swaying, a bit of hopping, and then this evolved into a full-out dance. This continued for quite a while, and a crowd of course began to form to see what on earth was going on. It must have been quite the spectacle. Jaffia's husband was concerned and also maybe a little bit embarrassed that his wife was causing such a stir. He pleaded with her to stop, but she wouldn't. Or couldn't. The crowd of onlookers grew bigger and the sky darkened as night began to fall. But Jaffia's dance continued on. Eventually, exhaustion overcame her and she collapsed into sleep. She awoke from her slumber only to begin to dance again. Word of Jaffia's dance spread far and wide, and on the third day even the nobles had gathered to watch. Jaffia's dance was contagious. Soon others found themselves twirling, leaping and toe-tapping. By the fourth day, over 30 people, men and women, were overcome with this mysterious dancing affliction. We'll never know what was going on in Jaffia's head and what compelled her to start dancing. At first it was speculated that she was doing this to spite her husband and also embarrass him. But as her dance continued, it became clear that she was in distress. Her feet were bloody and bruised. It wasn't that she wouldn't stop, it's that she couldn't.
Was it demons? It was definitely demons.
You know, you're actually kind of right. Many people did think that it might be demons. People felt that women were more susceptible to these kind of things. I mean, obviously we have weaker minds and morals. Discussions on her condition continued. I'm sure that it was all anyone could talk about. Eventually, the consensus was that this was the wrath of St. Vitus, the patron saint of dancers, and so her affliction was diagnosed as St. Vitus's dance. Jaffia's cycle of dancing until exhaustion continued for a whole 6 days. At this time, authorities thought, you know what, enough is enough. Something had to be done. She was put in a wagon and carted off to a shrine of St. Vitus, all the way up a mountain. However, they had acted far too late. This dancing affliction had already begun to spread. By early August, there were at least 100 people dancing in their homes, in the squares, and in the streets. Now, there was an elite council in Strasbourg called the 21. They had been watching the growing crisis and pondering a solution. They consulted with Strasbourg's leading physicians, which was a rather sensible thing to do. And it was decided that the dancing, it wasn't caused by demons, God, or a vengeful saint. They had come up with a much more scientific explanation. The dance was a natural disease caused by overheated or hot blood. So, what did they decide was the cure for this dance mania?
Oh, I know this one. Bloodletting. That was the cure for everything back then.
That was my first guess too. But actually, they went with something much nicer. More dancing. If they danced enough, they would sweat out the residues from this hot and overheated blood. Now that the 21 knew the cause and how to remedy it, they sprung into action. Guilds were instructed to clear their halls to make space for the dancers. How they managed to corral these frenzied dancers in there with their flailing limbs, I'll never know. Next, the outdoor grain market was cleared, and more dancers were herded in here, where they could dance to their heart's content. It was surrounded by walls which would provide a little bit of shade from the unrelenting hot summer sun. The 21 had a stage constructed for the dancers, and they hired musicians to encourage the dancers to, well, keep on dancing. The air was filled with the joyous sounds of drums, pipes, fiddles and horns. But this music was played day and night, incessantly, until it probably wasn't such a joyous sound anymore, especially combined with the rhythmic thuds of clogs and boots on the wooden stage. There was also probably quite an unpleasant aroma going around, with the smell of sweat. I mean, it was the height of summer. Also, the smell of other, more unpleasant bodily fluids. One chronicler reported that they danced without interruption until they fell unconscious, so I don't imagine that they were stopping for any toilet breaks. The enthralling music and the fact that the afflicted were now in full view for all to see made dancing just far too irresistible. Now, the general population wouldn't have believed this whole hot blood theory. They knew better. It was St. Vitus's wrath, and it was only a matter of time before his anger fell upon them for their own sins. More and more people succumbed, and eventually it is thought that around 400 people gave in to the mania. Guards were tasked with preventing the dancers from stopping, and then, it's quite ludicrous, but they started paying healthy people to dance with the afflicted, to keep them moving and to prop them up so that they wouldn't fall over or collapse. A testament to just how frenzied and entranced the afflicted were is that often the healthy people just couldn't keep up. They kept having to be swapped out. It's kind of like a very bizarre hostage situation. These poor people were trapped in dance, no matter how exhausted, drenched in sweat or painful their bodies were. And, with the new measures that were enforced by the 21, they were probably still forced to dance even after they had come to their senses and this hot blood or whatever it was had worked its way out of their systems. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't long before people, hungry, fatigued and very, very dehydrated, began to die. One chronicler stated that around 15 people died a day. Now, this is likely quite the exaggeration, as that would have probably nearly wiped out the whole town. Other chroniclers simply said that many of them danced until they were dead. Given the use of the word many, it's likely that a sizable number of people unfortunately lost their lives. The 21 soon realised that their plan was not working. In fact, they'd probably made the situation a lot worse. They now thought that maybe their fancy medical explanation was wrong, and that the diagnosis for triatropia was right. It was indeed a curse from St. Vitus, and this affliction was spawned from sin. And so they tore down that stage and they decided that public dancing should be banned, and it would be punishable with a very hefty fine. This was quite a big deal because dance was a large part of the culture. Music was also banned, except for in the homes of priests and the wealthy, of course. And even then it would only be stringed instruments. Apparently they thought that this gentler music was less likely to ignite the mania. Colourful clothes and jewellery were also banned, and then formal prayers were started to be said for the afflicted. However, the dancing continued on. In late August, the 21 had another bright idea. They arranged for the dancers to be bundled into wagons, still dancing, mind you, and carted off, squished up like little sardines to the shrine of St. Vitus all the way up the mountain. The shrine would have been thick with incense as Latin incantations were chanted. Red shoes had been made for the afflicted, which is strange because red dye was very expensive. Why red was chosen is unknown, but it may represent St. Vitus's burning feet. You see, legend has it that he was tortured by being made to stand in a cauldron filled with boiling lead and tar. However, he miraculously emerged unscathed. The colour red also seems to make an appearance in accounts of other dancing plagues. Holy water was sprinkled on the shoes, and crosses were drawn on the shoes of each person with consecrated oil. They were then led around an altar of the saint, to which they would sacrifice a penny. For over a month, St. Vitus's curse had gripped the town in a dancing frenzy. But after the pilgrimage to his shrine, the dancing plague did indeed begin to peter out, ending just as mysteriously as it started. To this day, no one knows what happened to Frau Trophea. It's just a complete mystery, but I hope that she survived the ordeal. So, what caused this bizarre affliction? Was it St. Vitus's wrath? Was it hot blood? Or perhaps something else?
Demons. Don't forget demons.
Right, so let's get our sleuthing hats on and take a look. One theory is that it was caused by ergotism. This is a poisoning caused from eating grains that have been infected by the ergot fungus. It absolutely loves damp rye, and rye makes lovely bread. Interestingly, ergot contains a component that can be used in the synthesis of LSD. Now, ergotism causes symptoms that broadly fall into two categories. Convulsive, so the person would suffer from seizures, jerking and twitching, and sometimes also delusions. And then, gangrenous. So here, the blood supply, particularly to the extremities, is restricted, and this causes the tissues to die, and so your fingers and toes could just drop off. This tissue death causes a hell of a lot of pain, and so, back then, it was referred to as St. Anthony's fire, or holy fire. Potentially, the convulsive symptoms could explain the affliction, but records from the time specifically say that the people danced, not that they convulsed or twitched or seized. They had different words for that. Also, there were no reports of St. Anthony's fire. So I think we can probably rule out ergotism as a cause. The next theory is Sydenham's chorea, a neurological disorder that is linked to rheumatic fever. It causes rapid, jerky, involuntary movements. It was actually occasionally referred to as St. Vitus's dance. But I think we can rule this one out too, as like the ergot poisoning, it doesn't actually cause dancing. It also usually affects children. Another theory is that they were in some kind of dancing cult. I didn't really get this one at first, but hear me out. Apparently there were some possession cults that desired the self-loss of trance, and so they deliberately cultivated this state. The dancers were definitely in a trance, but unwillingly, it would seem. The final candidate is mass psychogenic illness. In this case, a physical expression of psychological distress that spread throughout the town. It's usually associated with long-term stress, and it can result in a trance state. Earlier on I emphasised that the 1500s were not a fun time. With famine and plague, death was always around the corner. The poor people in Strasbourg were so broken by this harsh world, which is probably what caused poor Trophea to begin her dance and others to follow. Malnourished and already fatigued, she entered an altered state of consciousness, and in her trance she was unable to stop dancing. They were also a highly religious and superstitious bunch. They looked at those who were already dancing and thought, you know what, I'm a sinner too. At some point St. Vitus is going to come for me. And the power of suggestion intensified each time a person was lured into the mania. And in their minds, St. Vitus's fury was so great that he wouldn't rest until the whole town was paying for their sins through dance. Interestingly, before this particular dancing plague, there had been at least 7 others, most of them occurring along the River Rhine. John Waller suggests that this might be because in these regions they had a very strong belief in St. Vitus and his curse. And if you think you're safe from this kind of thing today, well, you'd be very wrong. It can often happen in schools and workplaces. There was the laughter epidemic in Tanzania in the 1960s, when nearly all the children in a school started laughing uncontrollably, some for up to 16 days, and there's many more interesting cases. I think mass psychogenic illness is probably the most likely cause for the dancing plague, but definitely let me know down in the comments what you think. If you'd like more curious, dark and mysterious tales, take a look at some of my other videos. Stay safe, try not to anger St. Vitus, and I hope you have a magnificent day.